Welcome to all of our attendees this morning. As always, we start with the tips to continually prevent COVID-19. And that is in order to keep hygienically clean on site. Not only are we preventing COVID, but also other occupational injuries or diseases rather, such as COVID-19, and then any other things that might be attached to what a plumber might do, especially because you are working with waste. So waste obviously carries a lot of bacteria and other viruses, and we want to protect our plumbers from that. So washing your hands regularly using soap and water for at least 20 seconds. But then if you don't have that available, please use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer. And if you are working, please avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with any unwashed hands. Adhere to social distancing, especially when people are sick. Cover your cough and sneeze with a flexed elbow or tissue, and please ensure that you bin that tissue after it's been used. And clean and disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces. Now, we've mentioned this before during housekeeping or cleaning and being hygienically clean, especially on site, but our objects and surfaces, things like tools that we are touching all the time, especially if we are borrowing them, using them across many different employees, we always want to ensure that as it moves from one employee to the next, it just gets wiped down. So perhaps have some sort of methodology in place, some sort of procedure to keep our hand tools continually clean. So any handles of any items that we are using or touching all the time, we obviously always want to ensure that we frequently disinfect these. If you can, please do your part and get vaccinated. Now, moving on to the Toolbox Talk for this morning, we are looking at heat. Last week, we looked at inclement weather, specifically looking at rain, storms, then lightning as well, and how this could have an impact on the work that our plumbers do. But we wanted to focus a lot on one of the sections of inclement weather being heat, and that is because we've moved into the summer months and the risk of heat stroke for our plumbers is very high. This is because a lot of plumbing work is being done on the outside of buildings or perhaps on construction sites where we are working without any roof covering at this stage. Now, a lot of the work obviously is also done indoors, in walls, in ceilings, but just because we're out of the sun, it doesn't necessarily mean that heat stroke is less of a possibility. You see, sometimes it is more of a possibility because some of these areas where we are working in are unfinished and not completely built yet. So there's no ventilation or proper ventilation, whether it be inside a ceiling or even inside a confined spaced area. And then the heat that is generated by the tools, by us working, breathing, multiple amount of people inside there could also build up and cause a potential for heat stroke. Next week, we're looking at Legionella, and then obviously we have changed the Toolbox Talk for the end of this month. We were going to focus on housekeeping, but because of the new OHS Act bill that's going to be enacted, we think it's coming in probably in 2023, but it already has been released. There's been comments on it, and it seems like this is the final draft of what's going to be released. And so we just want to touch base with all of our plumbers on what is the new OHS Act bill. What does it mean for you, and how can you go about now starting to comply with it? So when it happens, you don't have to run around figuring out why is the safety officer on site asking me for all these additional items that I don't have yet. Now, I know this is a subject of a lot of, how can we put it, difficult, let's just put it, it's an argument on site. People come to site and they get upset because the safety officer is asking them for something that the plumber doesn't actually know that they need. And sometimes it turns into be quite a serious argument between the client and the plumber. And this is what we are trying to alleviate. What we really want to do is remove that stress from you. We want to give you the information and to tell you exactly what you are responsible for and what you are not responsible for on site. Now, there are pieces of legislation out there already that you as a plumber know that you have to have on site, such as your safety files, your medicals, your general working at heights, firefighting, first aid. But when is this necessary according to the law, and when do you not need it? These are the questions that obviously we want to raise with you and assist you. So please remember, as an IOPSA member, if you have any questions, you do get 100 free consulting. So this is digital consulting from OHSS. So if you email info@ohss.co.za or you send them a WhatsApp message on 071-875-2070, just tell them or give them the information that you are looking for. What are you battling with on site? Perhaps a question has been raised. Just recently, we've handled quite a few questions on what is actually working at heights. Some clients were telling our plumbers that they were not allowed to work on a ladder that was higher than 2 meters. Now, that's not according to the law. You see, sometimes a client will hear something, perhaps from a friend or a colleague, that they might have heard from somebody else, but it actually comes from the construction site that they were working on. And then we go into a private home or we go into a corporate area and they want to implement this type of legislation now into that environment. And that is incorrect. Construction is separate to a lot of other areas where we work. However, there are times where a plumber has complained that it's not construction work. And when we've delved into the actual scope of work that is being performed, we have found that it does fit the meaning or the definition of the word construction. And so then the plumber has to adhere to what the construction regulation says for those sections. So if you are confused, if you've been given a question, if you've had hassles on site and you're not sure, please remember, as an IOPSA member, they are giving you free consulting digitally to info@ohss.co today, as well as 071-875-2070. Please remember that is a WhatsApp number. So if you do try and phone, you're just going to get somebody telling you to send a WhatsApp in any case. And then if you want to get in touch with us directly at our OPSA at the safety department, that is safety@opsa.org. So the safety thought for this week: heat stress isn't cool. What can we do to prevent it? How do we understand heat stress? And what can you do as a plumber to prevent heat stroke and heat stress from affecting you and your employees? Well, for one thing, excessive exposure to heat can obviously cause a range of different heat-related illnesses, from heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and obviously heat stroke. And heat stroke is going to be probably one of the most dangerous, because heat stroke is a condition that is caused by your body overheating. Now, as soon as your body's temperature overheats, this is generally when it gets to 40 degrees or higher. This is the most serious type of heat injury. The condition is most common in the summer months, obviously. So we understand this, especially now as we've moved into the summer months, being out on the road, being out even on bicycles. We've taken a look at a lot of our GPSs, telling us what the temperature is currently. And on some of the areas where we've been riding, it's 40, 41, 42 degrees Celsius. That is a lot of heat. And because you are doing physical exertion, so a lot of us are working in these extreme temperatures, we're carrying things, we're lifting things, and then obviously doing our day-to-day work, we are physically exerting ourselves within these high temperatures, making it even more dangerous or even more susceptible to this very common heat stroke potential. Now, heat stroke requires emergency treatment. The reason is, if it is untreated, heat stroke can damage your brain, your heart, your kidneys, and your muscles. The damage will worsen the longer the treatment is delayed, including the risk of serious complications. If you just think of the things that it's actually affecting, heat stroke can damage your brain. Well, this is obviously something that we need in order to do our work, our heart, our kidneys, our muscles. Now, if it is damaging that, there could be complications later on as well. There is even the potential that it could become so severe that it could cause a person's death. Now, we might think, well, that's, in very unlikely cases, very severe cases. Yes, it is sometimes unlikely that it will happen on a site, but the most likely chances of it happening are during these next few months. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to ensure that we know and understand what is heat stroke, how can we prevent heat stroke, and then what type of procedures do you have in place to actually prevent this from occurring and then affecting yourself or your employees. Well, for one thing, we want to look at the symptoms of a heat stroke. So if you are working in a hot environment, you've noticed that the sun is really beating down, perhaps you don't have a temperature gauge, just look on an app, perhaps ask the safety officer on site, your supervisor on site, to take a look at what the temperature actually is. Because if you are feeling tired, and this is not a normal tired, obviously if we're working hard, you are going to feel a degree of tiredness, but this will then be accompanied by being dizzy or perhaps having a headache, maybe even feeling sick or feeling nauseous, excessive sweating and skin becoming pale and clammy, or if you start getting a heat rash. But a change in skin color can be harder to see, obviously, on darker skinned persons. So what else are you looking for? Perhaps cramps in your arms, in your legs, in your stomach. If you have faster breathing or a faster heart rate, perhaps you have a higher temperature. Now with COVID-19, we obviously have a lot of items on site where we can test temperature, because COVID-19 wanted us to test persons' temperatures. And so perhaps you already have this available and you could use this as a tool to see, is a person perhaps suffering a symptom of heat stroke? Being very thirsty, and then obviously also being accompanied by weakness. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have one of these, you definitely have heat stroke. As you can see, some of these could be a symptom of COVID-19. It could be a symptom of fatigue. It could be a symptom of overwork or stress. However, if the environment is creating any one of these symptoms, obviously, then it is not an optimal environment. And if you are working in the sun, doing physical exertion during this hot periods of time, there is a possibility, a high possibility, that it could turn into heat stroke. And so please have a look out for these symptoms and make sure that you try and prevent them. Also, you're going to then try and prevent other items that could arise, but we're not going to talk about that. We're only going to look at your heat stroke. So first thing, what are we going to do for treatment? Well, very importantly, you want to ensure that you have your own procedures in place. Most of the time, your procedures that are going to be in place for heat stroke or heat stress or any type of emergency situation is actually going to be in your emergency management plan. And this will generally be under medical emergencies. And that is because you are going to need professional assistance in this case. It's not like fire where you've been trained for fire and you can handle firefighting. If it becomes an emergency, you might then need to get the fire department in. So if a medical emergency happens, heat stroke could be one of those medical emergencies. And you must have a procedure in place of what to do. The first thing you're going to do is obviously call the emergency services. Remember, heat stroke requires medical attention because it could have damaged internal organs. And if that is the case, there could be complications later on, or even the possibility of a person dying because of a heat stroke. Then you want to remove excess clothing. So don't remove the person's clothing. We want to remove excess clothing. So let's say the person is now in a cordoned off area. As you can see on the picture on the left-hand side, no work is going to be taking place around this because there's an emergency situation currently happening. The first aider will then address the scene. They will make sure it is safe in order to assist this person. They will then perhaps remove the high visibility vest, so that it's not an extra layer keeping in heat onto that person's body. Perhaps they'll have a reflector vest or perhaps even a reflector jacket on. Now, if they have a shirt on the underneath, you can then remove the jacket because it is excess clothing, but you will not remove the shirt and then expose the person. So please remember this. We are not removing the person's clothing. We are just removing excess clothing. And then we want to try and cool the person down with maybe water or fanning the person, try and keeping them cool. Now, obviously, if we're trying to keep them cool, we don't want to put them in direct sunlight. So please remember, wherever the person is placed, we want to also keep the place where they are in as cool as possible. Now, if the person is conscious, then you can give them small amounts of water to drink, especially if it is heat stroke. But please do not do this if you are not a first aider. And if you are a first aider, please make sure you have been trained to understand how this employee is going to be affected by this. You will know and understand that when you are trained in first aid, it's nil per mouth, and that is the medical terminology that they'll use. You're not allowed to put anything in that person's mouth. So if they are conscious, you hand them water and let them drink the water. Keep the person cool at all times. So again, wherever you place this person, should be in a relatively cool area, covered in a bit of a shady place, and then try and use something to fan them down or keep them cool. You can use a wet towel over their forehead. Wet towel, please do not use hot water. You obviously want to use cool running water on a wet towel so that it cools down their head and perhaps brings their body temperature down as well. And you can also put it around the back of their neck in order to bring down that body's temperature. We want to obviously elevate the feet and then let them rest until help arrives. Now, obviously, when it comes to any type of treatment, you need to be trained in order to give this treatment. So for 1 to 5 employees on a site, you need to have a first aid box. For 1 to 10 employees on a site, you need to have a qualified first aider. But now I want to ask you the question. If you have 5 people on site and the law says you do not have to have a first aider, how would you know how to use the items in the first aid box? Would it not be logical for you, if you worked in a high-risk environment, and it was only 5 of you, to have a qualified first aider? So you can see the minimum compliance in terms of the law is saying that you only need to have a qualified first aider once you have reached 10 employees. But knowing the degree of danger, knowing the risk assessment on a site, some clients may say to you, even though you have 5 employees, you must have a first aider on site. Are they allowed to ask this? Yes, 100% they are allowed to ask that based on the degree of risk and danger you are facing on a site. Remember, the law is the minimum requirements. We always want to reach for a higher standard of health and safety. Now, can the client change their mind from when they first started working to maybe a few weeks later and say, in the safety specification, we didn't ask for a first aider. Now we are asking for a first aider. Well, that will depend on 2 things. Number 1, are they asking for it for the correct reason? And number 2, does the reason dictate that the necessity of a first aider will mitigate risks? So what we are asking is, if the client says to you at the beginning of the project, you don't need a health and safety first aider, you only have to have 5 employees with a first aid box, but 2 weeks later they say you have to have a first aider, and now you have to outlay money for training and take time off work. Well, first of all, we're going to ask what has changed that allowed the client to ask for this. Has there been an incident? Did somebody get hurt? Has your risk increased? So what is the scope of work? Well, you're working on the floor when you started working, but now the work has escalated and you will now need to be accessing scaffolding, working on a roof, and working with mobile elevated working platforms. Because the degree of risk has changed and become a lot higher, they are allowed to ask for additional health and safety requirements. But according to contractual law, this is a change of contract, and obviously the employer or whoever's involved in your HR, not on your HR side, your procurement side, they will then need to jump in and say, but this is now a change of scope, it's a change of contract. And so you will need to then re-quote for the work, because you are allowed to change your quote to include the items that you require for site. The client cannot then tell you, well, it's a legal requirement, you just have to have it. That is incorrect. It is not a legal requirement. It is now over and above the legal requirement. You're not saying you don't want to do it. What you're saying is the parameters have changed by the hand of the client. And so you now need to adjust your quoting side as well. And we have helped a lot of plumbers with the client to understand that as well. So preventing heat stress, what can you do to prevent this from happening to you? Well, for first thing is to know the signs and symptoms. How do you determine whether it's heat stress or not? Well, you're not a doctor. You will not, first of all, understand that when you look at somebody, they're going to have heat stress. But if you see somebody acting in a perhaps a bit of a groggy way, they look a little bit dizzy, they're not feeling very well, they feel a bit nauseous, they're very weak and very tired, you can see them sweating a lot, you could probably pick up that something is wrong. You might not know 100% what it is, and obviously none of us will know that because we are not trained for that, but we'll know and understand the symptoms or the signs that could be a potential for heat stress. So when you are looking for this, please take a look and see if there is a possibility of it. Then you want to act immediately and trying to isolate that person and get them the attention that they need. The best idea would be to get them to the first aider. Then also monitor yourself. Don't only look at others, but look at yourself. Are you feeling a bit dehydrated? Have you had enough water to drink? And when we talk about water, we are saying clean running water. Please refrain from drinking too much cold drinks, too much sugary drinks, because that will dehydrate you even more. Excess alcohol will also ensure that you are going to dehydrate your body. So water is going to hydrate your body, and it's going to prevent a lot of heat stress. And be diligent about doing this, because if you do see any signs of heat stress in yourself or in anyone else, you want to treat them immediately. Then try and block out direct heat sources or direct sun, if at all possible. You want to shield yourself from the sun. So we have a lot of hard hats that come with sun visors. So it's like a brim around the hat in order to give you a little bit more shade. Try and work in shadier areas. And perhaps, as again, like we've spoken about before, can you plan your work so that perhaps you're doing the most dangerous work in direct sunlight in the earlier hours of the day or the later hours of the day where the sun is not at its strongest? Then when it comes to the middle part of the day, between 11 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when you can do work that is a little bit more in the shade. It depends on the type of work you're doing. It depends on where you're working. This is 100% determined on your scope of work, but it means proper planning is necessary in order to know and understand how you can prevent this from actually happening. And then different types of PPE that will help you to keep sun blocked or sun shaded, and then even using an approved sunscreen, perhaps recommended by your medical practitioner. If you can at all possible, working in areas, we obviously look at facilities regulations. It tells us that any working environment must be well ventilated, either by mechanical means or by natural means. Now, natural means obviously is just the airflow in and around a building. If there is no airflow, that means there is no natural ventilation. That means you have to have mechanical ventilation in place, because the facilities regulation states that we must keep our employees safe. So is there a possibility of having a cooling fan or an air conditioner indoors to help reduce the amount of heat that you are facing in and around this type of environment? Remember, you are just as likely to get heat stress indoors as you are outdoors, depending on the situation that you are working in. Now, with heat stress, heat stroke, there is another very dangerous thing that could happen during the summer months. And this is particularly when you are now going to be taking a break. So when it comes to occupational health and safety, we always focus on you at your work site. But when you go home, you and your family are at high risk of sunburn, especially when you are in your own home. So please take safety home with you. Sunburn seems to be not so dangerous. It happens to us every year. We get sunburned, we peel, we're all right. But please remember, sunburn is not only painful, it is dangerous and comes with consequences, because sunburn causes DNA damage to the skin, accelerates skin aging, and increases your lifetime of skin cancer risk. So sustaining 5 or more sunburns in your youth increases lifetime melanoma risk by 80%. Now, most South Africans obviously has had more than that, because almost every December down on the beach, we are getting sunburned. This is going to catch up with us in our later years. So if you can, please help yourself. If it's too late for you, help your children. Please ensure that you're preventing sunburn. Ensure that this part of your body, that you are protecting it, because your skin is going to be very needed later on in life. It's going to cause other complications that cancer could spread and obviously cause our death later on. So avoid the sun during your peak hours, if at all possible, between 10 and 2. Seek shade. Wear clothing with SPF protection. Wear sunglasses with UV protection. Wear a wide-brimmed hat. Always apply sunscreen at least 15 minutes before you go outdoors. Even on a cloudy day, the sun could also have a potential to burn you then. And then very importantly, as well as our families, we want to keep our pets safe. Heat stroke is obviously a very serious condition that can progress very quickly. And in severe cases, it can cause seizures, organ damage, and death in our pets. Now, most cases of heat stroke in dogs occur during exercise, but it can also be caused by being trapped somewhere hot, like in a parked car. So please, if your dog is showing any signs of heat stroke, immediately first contact your vet. The quicker your dog is cooled down and treated by the vet, the better their chances are of full recovery. And this goes for most animals. Then any obese or flat-faced, young, elderly, giant breed, long-haired dogs are at the most risk. So it is important to please do not leave dogs in hot cars. And if you are working or out and about and you are in the sun quite often, remember your furry little friend that is next to you doesn't have the same amount of protection as you. So please keep these precautions. Make sure they also have a lot of clean running water for them. So that brings us to the end of our toolbox talk. Remember, heat stress isn't cool. Try and prevent it as much as possible. If you see it coming, make sure you have a process or procedure in place to protect yourself. Next week, we will be looking at Legionella. What is Legionella and what is the dangers? And how can we take this information and also give that to our employers or perhaps even our clients that we're working with? And then at the end of the month, please tune in for the new OHS Act bill. Remember, it is going to impact you. There are changes that you need to make, and we want to help you to make that as soon as possible. So we'll hand it over back to you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this informative session. We've got a comment from Kurt this morning. If you can't keep the top of your hand on the tar for 30 seconds, then it's too hot for your dog to walk on.
Thank you very much, Kurt. That is a brilliant piece of advice. Obviously, we've got shoes on, running shoes, slops that we protect our feet from. We obviously don't always feel it. And that is always out of mind when we think of our animals. So maybe, Karim, to end off, instead of me saying it, if you wouldn't mind just stating that fact again. And that would be my ending comments as well. I think that is brilliant.
Awesome. So the comment is, if you can't keep the top of your hand on the tar for 30 seconds, then it is too hot for your dog to walk on. That is really great advice. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you to everyone who attended this morning. I'm going to go ahead and end the session now.